What's up with government by WhatsApp? Well, because the stunning lockdown files of released messages from the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock demonstrates what we feared all along, that this government was trapped in a terrifying and undemocratic groupthink in which headlines, being seen to act and avoiding battles with political rivals is what shaped the pandemic response. COVID measures, masks, lockdowns, school closures, those pathetic plastic screens in shops and arrows in supermarkets, which I consider nothing more than COVID theatre, were nothing to do with public health and everything to do with politics. Masks are the perfect example. They covered our faces to protect their arses. I'm talking about the politicians. No overwhelming, compelling evidence that these environmentally damaging and socially harmful devices, which are now rotting in landfill and clogging up our oceans, would make a blind bit of difference to stop the spread. In full let's be seen to do something mode, the outgoing Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon chose to mask kids in schools, some as young as 11, sat in the classroom all day long, their faces covered. According to these messages on WhatsApp, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's response was that we'd better mask kids in England too, in order to avoid a battle with Sturgeon. Did they even think for a moment, for a second, what impact this might have on kids, on their mental health, their physical and well-being, of course, and their education? As well as comparing countries that had mask mandates and those that didn't, the most recent Cochrane review, the most authoritative study to date, suggests that during the pandemic, masks did nothing. But without compelling data backing them up, all of these measures rolled on courtesy of our WhatsApp government. The messages pinged back and forth, no doubt fuelled on occasion by taxpayer-funded red wine. This vain and shallow soap opera was played out as our lives, our economy and our society were egregiously damaged. It's heroic journalism from the Telegraph newspaper and sheer courage from their reporter Isabel Oakeshott, who has brought opprobrium on herself for breaking her silence and sharing these messages. Astonishingly, rather than receiving praise from fellow journalists, she was harangued this week by the likes of the Today programme on the BBC. There's a surprise, as they grilled her about sharing these messages.
My responsibilities, having finished that book with him, are now to the public interest.
Did you break an NDA?
I mean, that's a matter of public record.
And did the Telegraph pay you?
Far more important. The public interest is far more important.
Did the Telegraph pay you for the messages?
I'm a working journalist.
So they did pay you for the messages?
I'm a working journalist. They did not pay me for the messages.
So why are these establishment media figures so critical of Oakeshott's decision to share all of these messages? Could it be because they don't want the public to know the truth? You tell me. Given the fact, of course, that it was establishment media like the Beeb, Sky and ITV and others who peddled the narrative that we had to lock down to save lives, and given the fact that they piled pressure on politicians to roll out these measures, perhaps they don't want to look back at what actually happened. And it was these establishment media figures, many big stars on TV and radio, who belittled, attacked and gaslit figures from the world of science, politics and ordinary members of the public, who looked at the pandemic response, masking people, closing schools and shutting the economy down on and off for 2.5 years, and said it was madness. We were all granny killers, and right-wing apparently. How does that work? Well, here we are with a wrecked economy, a national debt of over £2 trillion, with £500 billion having been borrowed to pay healthy people to stay at home and improve their banana bread recipe. Beyond that, we also have diminished kids and a sadder, angrier, poorer, sicker and more divided society. Don't forget, part of these COVID measures, which in my view were about making headlines, saw the NHS effectively going on strike, focusing on the elimination of one virus at the expense of everything else. The legacy? A waiting list of over 7 million people. But it's about your health. And these WhatsApp messages demonstrate the cavalier and unaccountable manner in which our public figures, drunk on power, rolled the dice in such a dangerous way. On one occasion, a top advisor joked with Matt Hancock about locking up visitors to the UK in hotel quarantine. Lol. Be clear, all of these measures were a gamble. They were a punt. The danger was oversold, the public were treated like children, and the reaction was truly catastrophic. I've been worried about this potential stitch-up of a public inquiry, which may fall into the intellectual trap of asking why we didn't lock down faster and harder. Luckily, with the release of these WhatsApp messages, this inquiry will be forced to take into account the non-evidence-based approach that underpinned all of these measures. I believe that history will show that we had too many of these measures, not too few, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces from this disastrous failed experiment, inspired, don't forget, by the Communist Party of China. The lockdown files reveal our worst fears. None of it was science, it was all politics. And whether it was parties at number 10 or hilarious banter on WhatsApp, they were laughing at us all along. Lockdowns were a cock-up, and now we have it in black and white. The message from these messages is very clear. We made a terrible mistake. Never again. What do you think? Now, the government will argue that without the COVID measures, lockdowns, face coverings and other interventions, many lives would have been lost. And they would argue that these measures, including masking, were carried out by countries across the world and that ensuring the NHS didn't become overwhelmed was their priority, something they would argue these measures achieved. That's not my view, but what's yours? This is Mark Dolan tonight, the home of free speech. Mark at gbnews.uk. Get those emails in.